one doctor who put it in my chart that I said this happened after the vaccine, but he didn't say that he thought it, but he said it verbally to me. And so that was interesting to me. So one of the immunologists, he put it into his notes. I believe this is an autoimmune thing. But the neurologist just recorded what I had said, but verbally he said to me that he believed this was caused by the vaccine. So I do think there is nervousness. I do think there is wariness in the medical community about, and possibly in the research community as well. I'd be interested to hear some anecdotes from medical researchers who are a little different from necessarily the doctors with boots on the ground as to whether they think that this is dangerous to them if they were to publish studies of that. I don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah, there's a question about the formal danger to people's careers, and then there's a lower level of coercion where people are socially concerned of what happens if they acknowledge a hazard. And I will point out, if you look at what's happening to Eric Clapton, there is a very clear message. Here we have a person, his nickname is Slowhand, right? This is a person who is famous for what he does with his hands. He found himself unable to do what he has done in life following a vaccination. Again, he can't be an anti-vaxxer. He took the vaccine willingly, was injured. And let's say that he was the only person on earth who had this, or let's say that it was a pure coincidence and not causal somehow. Still, how unkind is it to not allow a human being to discuss his own experience, an experience that any of the rest of us in his shoes would be saying the same thing. I feel like this vaccine caused this problem with my hands, the way that
ruined my life.
Right, ruined my life. And so I guess the point is I'm watching him stigmatized publicly as if he is somehow the culprit.
Right.
When at worst, he has drawn a connection that doesn't deserve to be drawn. And more likely, actually, he's suffered an injury and he's entitled to talk about it. Right. It just seems to me so cruel that society would take a position that those who have had an experience must be silent about it for fear that it will cause other people to worry about something which they should probably worry about.
Right, exactly. It should be possible to say, you should be a little more worried about that. I'm perfectly open to saying, yeah, I think people should be more worried about this. I just today read an article from Australia. I don't remember the name of the person. And I think it was a heart attack. I think he had, or no, maybe it was just myocarditis. Anyway, it was a heart inflammation. And he was interviewed and they let him tell his story and it went into the news, but he had to say over and over and over again in the story, I'm not trying to make anybody vaccine hesitant. It's not my goal to make anyone hesitant about getting the vaccine here in Australia. And then he would go, but at the same time, I do think this should be studied more, et cetera, et cetera. And he was having trouble getting his thing reported to the Australian version of VAERS. He had to do it himself, but he believed that if his doctor did it, it would have more, it would be taken more seriously or whatever. And the doctor said, I'm too busy. You get online and do it type thing. And so even the person writing the articles seemed to accept that it had been caused, but kept saying rare over and over again, But it bothered me. There was something very propagandistic about the fact that this man could only get his story told if he said about 5 times, I'm not trying to make anybody vaccine hesitant. Well, what the heck? He should be allowed to say, man, I think maybe people should be more hesitant about this, and you still ought to tell his story. It's an interesting story.
Well, I almost feel like this is an epistemological crime. I don't know if that's a category, but I think the point is a human being is not built for a world of formal science. A human being is a brilliant creature that is capable of taking information. Some of that information will appear meaningful and turn out not to be, right? But a human being needs to be able to say, look, my friend group went and got vaccinated and there wasn't an incident among them. But you can't say that if somebody who had had an incident would have to think twice about speaking publicly about it, or they would have a social catastrophe on their hands, right? So the point is, you don't know. It seems like the events are rare, but the rarity may in part, how many people have been effectively silenced watching what's happening to Eric Clapton and saying, you know what, it's not worth it. I'm not going
simply not making the connection. That is true as well. I watched an interview with the lady. Her first name is Deborah. She was a physician's assistant. You probably know the interview I'm talking about. Anyway, she was told by her fellow medical practitioners, you file the VAERS reports, we're too busy, there are too many of them, et cetera, even though they were sufficiently important that they were actually required by law to do it. But they let her do it for them for a while, and then they said, no, just do it on your own patients. Anyway, she was, oh man, I forgot where I'm going with this, but I know what it was. She was saying that she had a colleague, an oncologist, who took to asking his patients, have you been vaccinated? So when their cancer was coming back out of remission, her colleague was noticing the connection and the patients were not. So I'm gonna tell you an anecdote. I'm gonna blind it a little bit here because this person hasn't given me permission, but I was talking to someone about my own experience, and she said to me, and this was a medical person in the medical field, and she said to me, oh, it's so interesting that you had the vaccine and you had this happen. That's odd. I had this thing where I was in terrible pain, and I was out in the sun, and I almost anaphylacted with a temperature reaction and so forth. And then I woke up in the middle of the night and I was screaming in pain. And she said, but I do think the vaccine is safe. So she had made no connection whatsoever until she heard my story. And she's a medical person. So I think it is underreported. And I think one reason is what you're saying. People are afraid of social ostracism. So we can't make that argument. Arguments from silence kind of stink anyway, but we can't make that argument from silence. I haven't heard anybody say anything, so it must not have happened in my friend group. That's a very weak argument. But also because I think there are cases where there is a plausible connection, but people are not making it because they're, as we say, their prior is so low. And so when their prior is really low, then they're not going to make that connection.
Right. Now, I, of course, haven't a clue what we are supposed to do with this, right? What ends up happening is those of us who have, I guess, accepted the price of talking about our negative experiences or our skepticism, our alarm, our inability to look away from the evidence that's accumulated in the VAERS system or the yellow card system, right? We have elected to pay a price, and so we have refused to dodge that price, I guess. And we talk to each other, and so that is liable to be distorting in a sense, right? When you find that you've got a group of people who is already paid the price and are interacting. And then you have another group that isn't paying the price, that is surrounded by a great deal of silence on the matter, also not getting a clear picture. And of course, I think the problem is, I've said this in other contexts, that science is a very beautiful and powerful process, but it is also a fragile process, that it depends on certain conditions being met. And it is not capable of overcoming something like a propaganda campaign that keeps evidence from emerging to a place where we can evaluate it.
Right.
And so I've been stigmatized as all sorts of things, including an anti-vaxxer. And I cannot seem to break through the wall of people who need to be thinking about why it is that people like you and I would end up in this very unpleasant situation of talking publicly about something that powerful forces do not want discussed. Now, I know,
right. or just blowing my own privacy. Like,
right.
How many people want to go out there? I'm lucky, right? My husband supports me. All right. So I don't think he's going to lose his job because I came out and did this, so I'm not going to be penalized nearly even as much as you have. But who wants to go out there and tell people I have horrible tailbone pain? I mean, it's usually something you keep private. It took me months to agree to pay, even that much of a price. But you're right. We don't want to be in a bubble. And Richard Feynman, the great physicist, said that science demands a particular kind of honesty, which is that you're willing to bend over backwards to bring in things that might possibly be contrary to your own view. And he was funny. He says, I don't care if you lie to your girlfriend, but when you're a scientist, you don't lie as a scientist. And so that's that fragility. I think he, in a sense, sensed that fragility that you're talking about there. And I'm not sure what's going to happen, but I do fear that signal is being broken, as you say, and public trust is certainly eroded. And the proceeding of science, at least in things surrounding COVID, is being broken in the world as a whole. I was going to say the United States, but other countries too.
Yeah, other countries too. In fact, absolutely terrible stories coming out of Australia. I interviewed a woman who has terrible immunological sensitivities, including anaphylactic shock as a result of exposure to polyethylene glycol, which is in 2 of the vaccines, and a close relative is in the 3rd, to which she has access. And she's being told she should be vaccinated anyway. She just should simply get vaccinated in a hospital where they can rescue her after she has her anaphylaxis, which is a medically nonsensical position in light of the fact that this disease, as bad as it is not smallpox. It's also rare in Australia, so the chances that anyone is actually protected from COVID itself by her being vaccinated makes no sense. And frankly, many people who were reluctant about vaccination and were vaccinated anyway were vaccinated on the basis that we needed to protect the vulnerable. And if she's not the vulnerable, then who is?
Right, exactly. And now we're hearing that myocarditis in children is mild. So we should be willing to send the children out there, vaccinate a bunch of little kids, and if they get myocarditis, hey, it'll probably be mild. Never mind the fact that COVID would probably be mild if they got COVID. So this is crazy.
COVID would be mild as far as we know. Myocarditis, the idea that this is a mild condition is preposterous. The idea that you would imagine that it is likely to be mild in children where they have a very long life ahead of them in which bad things can happen, right?
You would even take that risk.
Right. There's no medical justification.
Right.
At best, the justification when it comes to children is that it will protect the old and infirm. But we as a society have never had the conversation where we say it's acceptable to rob young people of health to protect the old and infirm. And I think, frankly, only a sick society would ever make such a choice.
It's ethically horrible.
Right. It's ethically indefensible, Absolutely. In my opinion. And so, yes, we're not having that conversation. We are also not, the other side is not playing fair. Right. Heather and I were very clear before there was evidence of myocarditis being a frequent. I don't mean frequent in terms of the number of people who have it, but frequent among the adverse events. We were alarmed that there was a danger of hazards that we didn't know about yet, and that we should be cautious for that reason. And now, of course, how many people have learned the term myocarditis because it is well understood to be caused by these vaccines? Where is the acknowledgement that, in fact, our caution was well placed? Right.
You predict things well, and you can see that the propaganda machine is getting out ahead of it. So the very fact that we're now being told myocarditis in children is usually mild, they can treat it with, Advil at home or whatever. What is that? It's preliminary propaganda. Yep. It's a prophylactic propaganda, you might say, so that if people say, I told you so, here now we've got a bunch of more, pericarditis and myocarditis cases among children there wouldn't be before. They're like, yeah, we already knew that would happen. We told you it would be fine. And not very many of them are dying. So stop worrying about it. So basically nothing is going to be allowed to shake this. It's a certain view of what should be done. And that view is not going to change, I fear.
Yeah, it's the ultimate epistemological sin, which is to start with your conclusion and work backwards from it and force the evidence to fit it no matter what the evidence suggests. And
My husband likes to use the metaphor of the Pink Panther, if I recall correctly. And he's used this for years. And that in the introduction, he would have a little hole and he would go down the hole, if you've ever seen the cartoon, and then he would pull the hole behind him and then it would disappear. So
right.
he's in there. He's locked down in there. And that's what's happening. We're doing the Pink Panther.
Yeah, it's a kind of hermetically sealing a perspective so that whatever evidence there is can't right. alter it. That is what appears to be happening. And there's just simply nothing apparently that can derail this train, which is the most frightening thing of all. Right? If you had the sense that the medical authorities were grappling with the evidence and that they were actually balancing the question of the harms of COVID, the deaths that will arise from people getting sick with this infection that we have not successfully controlled, and that they were balancing that with the potential harm to people from being vaccinated to prevent the disease, well, then there's a lot of discussion we can have. Adults can understand that this vaccine doesn't have to be completely safe in order to be worthwhile. But what one gets the sense is that we've just sort of definitionally decided it's safe, and that it has nothing to do with evidence, and that evidence, will be dismissed if it arises as it has.